Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about King Kong vs. Godzilla from 1962. I grew up watching the Showa era films on TV a lot. They were always seemed to be on for some reason on TBS or TNT. And this was one I never liked as a kid, watched as an adult before reviewing this, and didn't like it again then. And I sort of, by rewatching this, and I inadvertently kind of watched the US version and the Japanese version, and I totally get why I didn't like it because of the US version, which isn't very good, whereas the Japanese version is a much better film, which I did not have access to at the time. There was only the US version, which is not just a dub. There is a dub apparently, but it's never made it to home video. I couldn't find it anywhere, unless, I'm sure if you can put in the links below, that'd be nice. But it's much like Godzilla King of Monsters, where they edit American crap in. They have like an American guy who's like, I don't know, it looks like Godzilla's coming to Mount Fuji soon or whatever, and then they like keep cutting back to like white guy who knows things, which is like really makes this movie suck tremendously. And it's unfortunate because you have two titans of, giant monsterdom. I don't really think King Kong is a kaiju. I guess in this movie and the next one that Toho would make, but this always felt like having the Flintstones meet the Jetsons or Family Guy meet the Simpsons or whatever. This felt like a major moment, basically. Like, you were having these two big things. It was a huge crossover. So of course, as a kid, I had to see it, and it was disappointing at the time. But I do really think like the US cut kills the momentum of this. Like, there are certain action sequences when I watched the Japanese cut, I actually liked some action sequences more, and then I went back and went, oh, because they like edited it wrong. No, they didn't. It just, the build up to that fight was so disappointing and just didn't really have a good flow to it, and was so awful that by the time I got to those fights, it didn't feel as good. Unless like there might be some frames trimmed or something like that. I doubt they even would cut the fight, because that's mainly why you're going. But there are certain sequences I could have sworn to you felt differently, and of course they did, because they're in a better movie, and that feels a lot better. Now, this film is the first color appearance of both King Kong and Godzilla. This is mainly made from Godzilla people, not King Kong people. Most of those guys were a lot older. There was an idea from Willis O'Brien, who's the stop motion animator of King Kong, that they would make something like King Kong vs. Frankenstein. He had this idea with John Beck, who then sold the rights to Toho, and so somehow this legally makes sense that it became King Kong vs. Godzilla. He ended up directing or making or doing the atrocity that is the US version. The movie itself is basically I think is a little more interesting than you'd think. It's mainly about them trying to find King Kong, because a pharmaceutical company is sponsoring a science show, and they realize if they are able to get a giant monster on the science show, it'll have huge ratings. So they decide to kind of make King Kong a publicity stunt, which is sort of a weird, this movie, the King Kong element is sort of a weird remake of the original King Kong, and also kind of predicting what would happen in the actual, I guess, remake of King Kong in the 70s, where they wanted him for publicity purposes. Same thing here. It's sort of a satire on how important people consider advertising, how they will literally bring a giant monster to Japan to destroy stuff because it'll get them a lot of publicity. I like how Ishiro Honda really gives this more of a satirical edge. I know he's brought that to other kaiju films before this one that he had done since Godzilla. This one, it mostly sort of works. They kind of drop it at a certain point, because we're not here to watch, satire. We're here to watch two giant monsters fight, and this film basically gives up on that at a certain point. But it's actually a cool idea, and I like how they do it with the two kind of young guys in it, and then their boss, who's played by this guy who's considered Ikiro Ashima, I think. I'm not sure. He was called the Japanese Charlie Chaplin. He's actually kind of funny. They do really try to make this into the human element something. I think that's something that Ishiro Honda was very good at, because if you look at the original Godzilla, I think that's an element that's very strong. I think that's also an element that's very strong in the next film. This is kind of, they're trying to make it goofier, which he wasn't totally on board with, especially like a lot of these two fighting was because wrestling had become very popular in Japan. This was they were doing more wrestling moves and things like that in this, and he considered Godzilla more of an antagonist. It's also interesting Godzilla is so much on the sidelines. He breaks out of the iceberg glacier thing, and then it's like he's just like coming to Japan while we focus far more on King Kong. I don't know if they fully, looked at this as like, we look at it now as like the third Godzilla movie, but I think they were like, I don't know, he'll just come back or whatever. This was to celebrate Toho's 30th anniversary. There were various films planned, one of which was Sanjiro, the Akira Kurosawa film, which is a sequel to Yojimbo, and this was, I guess, to follow up on the huge success of Godzilla. And this film was an actual big success. It was a huge success in America. It was the highest attended Godzilla movie of all time in Japan. As a kind of pseudo way to expand the series, I think it works, but it's not really what the series would become. And I think more of what the series is and the heights of the series is really the next film, which is Mothra vs. Godzilla. That I often see credited more with like launching the idea of Godzilla fighting a different kaiju. I guess this sort of does, sort of doesn't, depending on the day of the week you want to consider what King Kong is. I guess in this they do put him in a monkey suit with Willis O'Brien. Really tried to fight when they're making the original King Kong so they can do a stop motion thing. I know there's always been talk of making a stop motion Godzilla, and although I actually think that would be really cool, this film is very cheesy. It's very 1960s kind of level Hollywood and things like that, so you kind of just accept it. I mean, King Kong's arms look like they're too big for the actor as the suit on or something. It looks very bizarre, and the fights are more like wrestling, and he grabs his tail a lot. The fight I never actually thought was that satisfying because you get basically two fights between them. You really should have more. I think, does this have the same amount of time that Godzilla fights in that first Godzilla movie, the American one from 2014 or something? I don't know if it's like, I'm curious because it doesn't have a lot. It's basically like Godzilla lights King Kong on fire, then they do have an epic fight, and then the fight kind of just ends with them falling in the water. I know there's that urban legend that in America you get the King Kong one, in Japan you got the Godzilla one. I'm not sure, like there are more countries this was released in, so like what would they do in Italy? I don't know. That's not true. The only difference between the cuts is apparently in the American cut they both roar at the end, and in the Japanese cut only Godzilla roars or something. Whatever. There's other articles that decipher that. I'd heard that before, but watching both, it just seems ridiculous because the end of the fight is so just, you're not really sure who won at all. It's like they just fall in the water and King Kong's like, fuck this, I'm swimming back to the island that I'm from that isn't Skull Island for some reason. I do think they're better fights, and I think this is kind of a weak fight. It basically, like, this film is held up by the fact that it is King Kong vs. Godzilla. I think that is what has always made this film so attractive. It's made it insanely marketable. You will definitely see it because of those two things. But I think when I watch Godzilla movies, this is never one I really revisit. I'll rewatch the fight with my daughter sometimes on YouTube, the end battle, which I kind of like on Mount Fuji to certain regards, but I will say it ends on this like, what happened, who won? Like, you kind of, I know there actually has been a lot of fans who said like they wouldn't mind this being remade because they want like more of a definitive thing, and I agree with that because there's certain elements of this that are a lot of fun. Like, I know King Kong's suit looks awful. I know there's a lot of cheesy, silly elements in this movie, but you sort of like it for all that stuff. Like, there's a kind of fondness to it. I think a lot of this stuff could be made by Ishiro Honda, who's, I think, kind of figuring out what to do with Godzilla. This is the transition point from, you know, just this is another sequel, maybe this is it kind of thing, to an actual franchise. And you can tell they're like not sure what to do with Godzilla. Like, should he be a villain still? Should he be a hero? What are we doing with him? I think in that confusion, and even the tones, like they had a problem, or serious or funny tones, he wasn't comfortable with the serious tone. It feels as much like it falls into it as much as it feels like sometimes they just drop stuff because they are like, well, no, this is what the movie does now, which I know Godzilla movies sometimes do in general, but I don't like it as much because I actually find the idea kind of interesting. They do it in a funny way that isn't really realistic. Like, why did they just cancel the science show and like make a show that would get ratings, but instead they're like, no, we have to get King Kong. And I sort of like that idea of it. I just wish they'd stuck to it a little more. Like, maybe he could have worn a sash for the pharmaceutical company or something like that. I don't know, just like really do it up. It just felt like I would have liked this to be a little more Verhoeven. It's a fine, fun movie. I don't think this is a great Showa era film. I think it's just a notorious film because of, you hear King Kong vs. Godzilla and you feel like you need to see it, but instead what you get is like a Japanese film commenting on TV ratings, which is not really, I think, what you think you're watching. You can find on the Internet Archive, they have the Japanese cut. You can find the American cut fairly easily. It does get confusing. I have the box set, the Criterion box set, and in the box set, it's pretty much everyone is the Japanese version, except for this movie for some reason, and then they have the Japanese cut on an extras disc, which I found out later. So I do feel like I really came around. Like, this is the best I've ever really liked this movie, is this time reviewing it, which was interesting. And I felt like I really got it watching the Japanese cut, which I hadn't seen before. So I still think the American cut is awful and does what most of the American cuts do, is like sort of disrespect the source material and dumb it up and like not even use the same music for some reason. I don't really get what their whole purpose was with that. But this is a fun Showa era kind of film. I get like putting it on, I get liking the fights, but I also get like rolling your eyes at how cheesy and stupid and silly this whole thing is. I guess it was trying to do that, but I think there are later films that do that a lot better and ones that I actually want to rewatch more. And I feel like with this one, I often just sort of go, ugh, I never really dug that one. I guess I've gotten a little more into it, but I just feel like a film that should have more. It should have a more epic battle. It should have a little more interaction between the two. It shouldn't be more of a King Kong movie than a Godzilla movie, everything like that. I think in a way this leaves it open for a sequel to do something with this idea of these two titans coming together, because it's like you kind of want them to be more, they each had huge hit films under their belt at the time that were highly influential, but you almost want the legacies of the two to go up against each other, and I don't think those were as set at the time as they are now. And so it works for when it was. You had the two major big screen monsters fighting one another, but I don't think it really lives up to that fight. It's not the epicness that fight should really deserve. This is a cheesy, fun 60s monster movie, and that's sort of all it really is. It doesn't have any more to it necessarily. It doesn't get its satire very well. You just got to watch these guys in suits have a fun time wrestling each other, and sure, that's fun, but there's not enough of that to really make this film a lot more than just a silly fun Godzilla movie. And maybe that's as much as audiences want, but it's something about this whole concept. It just feels like you build up these kind of battles in your head. There's a certain epicness to it, and maybe like Freddy vs. Jason, maybe like all those fights in your head, you build it up almost too much. I feel like maybe that's hurting this film, but it's that, I think all of that, it just doesn't live up to the hype of what this film really should be. So if you have seen King Kong vs. Godzilla and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.